It started with something so simple that, at first, Maya Coleman thought she was overreacting. A sign, nothing more than a heavy-duty aluminum property marker she had ordered online, bolted into a treated cedar post and installed at the edge of her newly purchased land parcel. Discreet, professional, just bold enough to make clear that this was not common ground. The black and silver letters read, "Private property. Owned by M. Coleman. Registered commercial use. Unauthorized access prohibited." It wasn't decorative, and it certainly wasn't meant to provoke. In fact, Maya had added it specifically because she had no intention of bothering anyone. Her lot sat on the far end of a residential loop, adjacent to an undeveloped greenbelt that once served as a tree buffer zone between the community and the county-owned floodplain. Her land was originally agricultural but had been reclassified under a minor-use commercial designation when she bought it. A zoning quirk from a county-wide adjustment 5 years earlier that now worked in her favor. She intended to use it modestly. Climate-controlled storage units for herbal products she distributed through small organic shops, and later she hoped a compact greenhouse where she could expand her beekeeping work. Nothing big, nothing loud, and certainly nothing illegal. It was her first serious venture, financed not by fantasy or borrowed risk, but by years of personal savings and a grant she'd won through a Women in Agriculture nonprofit. She had been deliberate in everything. The paperwork, the permitting, the insurance. Every square inch documented and double-checked. There was no reason to anticipate trouble. But then the sign disappeared. Not stolen. That would have been cleaner. Instead, it had been coated in a thick, uneven layer of white exterior paint, likely applied in haste and with something cheap, like a mop. Beneath the drying streaks, someone had written, in red marker that bled slightly from the moisture, "Community property, entry encouraged. We keep this area safe." Maya stood over it for several minutes, arms folded, trying to process the implications. This wasn't random vandalism. It was territorial, authoritative. Someone had taken the time not only to erase her claim, but to replace it with a direct contradiction. It was meant to tell her something. More than anything, it reeked of passive-aggressive politics, the kind of power play dressed up as concern for the neighborhood that Maya had seen before, but never quite so close to home. She didn't live on the property yet. There was no house, only a gravel pad and a trailer she used as an office on workdays. But she was there regularly enough to notice patterns. And by the end of that week, a pattern was emerging. A city notice was taped to the utility pole at the lot's edge, warning of unauthorized development on site. Someone had filed a complaint. Maya called the number and was reassured it was probably a mix-up, but the tone of the official shifted subtly when she gave her address. "That's within Glen Ridge Estates buffer zone, isn't it?" the woman asked. Maya frowned. "No, it borders the greenbelt." Glenridge ends at the other side of the creek. There was a pause, then a quiet, "Huh. That's strange. The complaint said you were violating community easement laws. But you're not even part of that association, are you?" She wasn't, not even adjacent, legally. Her parcel was distinct, and her deed, which she had read obsessively, made it crystal clear. No easements, no right-of-way, no shared liability. It was hers. But Glenridge didn't seem to think so. Or, more accurately, someone in Glenridge had decided that boundary lines were a matter of interpretation. It wasn't long before she learned who. A folded letter appeared under the wiper blade of her truck one afternoon, scrawled in looping cursive on linen-textured stationery. "Dear Ms. Coleman," it began. "As president of the Glenridge Community Council, I feel it necessary to express concern on behalf of several residents who've noticed increased activity on what they understood to be shared recreational space. Perhaps there has been a misunderstanding about the nature of your land's designation. We encourage you to attend our next planning meeting to discuss more appropriate usage that benefits everyone. Regards, Grimes. Maya didn't need to look it up. She had heard the name already, Karen Grimes, from the man who installed her fencing. "Watch out for that one," he had muttered as they unrolled chain link along the western edge. "Walks around like she owns the air rights." Maya didn't respond to the letter. There was nothing to discuss. Her land was private, lawfully purchased and titled, and yet things continued to escalate. Within days, 2 contractors she had been working with, both of whom had previously agreed to short-term hauling and grading work, withdrew without explanation. A county inspector arrived unannounced the following week, citing another anonymous complaint. And then, the final insult, her water service, which had been installed independently through a municipal hookup on the east side of the property, was abruptly cut off. The utility company claimed it was due to a maintenance scheduling issue, but wouldn't commit to a restoration date. By now, Maya understood what was happening. This wasn't a coincidence. This was pressure, quietly but deliberately applied in hopes that she would fold. But Maya Coleman wasn't the folding kind. She didn't scream, she didn't post rants online, and she didn't drive to some HOA office demanding answers. She did what made sense. She called her attorney. Not a friend or a favor, but a paid professional who had reviewed her purchase agreement 6 months earlier and confirmed back then that the lot was clean. Now, Maya scheduled a meeting and laid everything out. The sign, the painted-over warning, the letter, the complaints, the water shut-off. The attorney, a practical man named Dorian with a calm voice and meticulous notes, asked a single question. "Do you have pictures of the sign?" She did. She had taken them the day she installed it. "Good," he said. "Let's start there." Maya also reached out to a licensed surveyor. Not because she didn't trust her deed, she did, but because she understood the value of verification. A third-party boundary assessment would preempt the inevitable claim that someone thought the lines weren't where they appeared. When the surveyor arrived, an older woman with a rolled blueprint tube under her arm and a laser rangefinder clipped to her belt, she squinted at the perimeter and nodded. "These people are hoping you're the type who won't check," she said. "You're not. That'll drive them crazy." It already was. Later that evening, as Maya returned to the property with a fresh printed sign in the bed of her truck, she noticed a white SUV parked halfway down the loop road. Headlights off, idling. When she pulled up and stepped out, the vehicle pulled away. No confrontation, no acknowledgement, just slow, calculated withdrawal. That same SUV would appear twice more that week, always keeping its distance, always silent. Maya didn't panic. She documented, she filed, and quietly, through back channels, her attorney submitted a formal cease and desist notice to the Glen Ridge Community Council, naming both the president and the council secretary as responsible parties for interference with legal land use. None of this made her feel vindicated. If anything, it left her with a deepening sense of how easily rules could be twisted into weapons. Not through brute force, but through erosion. They weren't trying to take her land by storm. They were trying to wear her down until she walked away from it herself, and for many people that would have worked. But Maya had learned to recognize the early signs of coordinated pressure. This wasn't about grass height or curb aesthetics. This was about someone, likely one person with just enough influence, wanting to erase her presence entirely. What Karen Grimes hadn't expected was that Maya was not alone. She had allies, not loud ones, but competent ones. And while Karen painted over signs and filed anonymous complaints, Maya was assembling a legal foundation sturdy enough to do something Karen never thought would happen: hold her accountable. And that, Maya thought as she drove home that night, was going to make all the difference. The letter arrived folded twice, placed not in the mailbox where it would have required processing by the Postal Service, but rather slid between the seam of the gate and the latch like an afterthought, or more accurately, like something left behind, by someone who didn't want it officially recorded. It was printed on high-grade letterhead paper, the kind used for homeowner updates and donation solicitations, with a crest in the corner that Maya recognized from Glenridge's community website. The text was short, clinical, and pointed. Not quite a threat, but not a request either. Ms. Coleman, we regret to inform you that as of this week, a formal complaint has been lodged concerning your use of the land adjacent to the Glenridge community perimeter. Please be advised that enforcement actions may follow should the matter remain unresolved. Respectfully, Office of Community Oversight. There was no signature, no contact person, just a printed address that routed to a shared P.O. box. Maya read it twice, then a third time, her fingers tightening slightly along the fold lines as her breath slowed. She'd expected resistance, even hostility, but not this particular tactic. This soft-bellied bureaucratic pressure cloaked in faux formality. It wasn't even legally sound, but it was crafted just well enough to make someone inexperienced doubt themselves. By the following Tuesday, a red notice was stapled to the wooden post at the far corner of her parcel, a place she rarely visited and only noticed the next time she walked the perimeter during routine maintenance. It was water-damaged from a light rain but still legible. Preliminary assessment of code violation. Pending review. The issuing body was vaguely named Neighborhood Compliance Board, which sounded official, but as Maya quickly confirmed, didn't exist within the county records. She called the number listed at the bottom. A voicemail picked up. You've reached the Community Services hotline. Leave a message with your case ID. No tone, no name, no traceable chain of command. It was shadow play. Threats crafted with just enough plausible legitimacy to unnerve anyone unfamiliar with the law. But Maya wasn't operating blind. She sent copies of the notice to Dorian, her attorney, who immediately flagged the language as intentionally deceptive. It's manufactured intimidation, he said calmly over the phone. They're testing your threshold. If you fold, they win. If you escalate prematurely, they use that against you. She listened carefully and understood. This was a chess game now. The next development came not through letters or signs, but silence. One of the cold storage units she had installed, climate-controlled, registered, inspected, stopped receiving scheduled deliveries from the partner farm cooperative she worked with. At first, she assumed it was a logistical error, but when the same missed drop repeated the following week, she contacted the supplier directly. The coordinator, a soft-spoken man named Jorge, apologized profusely and admitted that they had been advised to pause their use of her property until zoning complications were resolved. We got a call, he said hesitantly, from someone claiming to be part of the community committee. They said you were under review. Maya asked if they had provided documentation. They hadn't, but the threat had been clear enough to make Jorge uncomfortable. They said they'd report us for unauthorized food distribution in a contested area. I'm sorry, Maya. We just can't take that risk right now. She didn't blame him. The call had done its job. It introduced uncertainty, enough to freeze relationships built on trust. By week's end, 3 more logistical partners had either pulled back or gone quiet. Maya found herself canceling standing appointments, renegotiating delivery routes, fielding questions she didn't have answers for. What she did have was a thickening file of every interaction, every warning, every photo of posted notices and painted-over signs. She documented methodically, obsessively, not just for her own record, but because Dorian had insisted on it. The more you give me, the less they can twist. You're not just preparing for a defense, you're building the framework of a countermeasure. His words grounded her. She wasn't retreating. She was preparing. Still, the psychological strain was real. She arrived one morning to find her gate slightly ajar, though the padlock was still intact. Nothing appeared stolen or broken, but she sensed the message. A week later, a small, unmanned drone hovered above her property for nearly 10 minutes before drifting back toward the neighborhood side of the creek. And one afternoon, while checking her perimeter fence, she discovered 3 plastic flags hammered into the ground, the kind used by utility companies to mark underground lines, but they were color-coded in a way she didn't recognize. She called the county to verify if they had authorized any survey activity. They had not, which meant someone had accessed her land under false pretense. When she informed Dorian, he didn't hesitate. "We're filing for injunction," he said. "This isn't just harassment anymore. They've crossed into provable interference with commercial activity." The paperwork was drafted within 48 hours. The filing named the Glen Ridge Community Council as the initiating party for a campaign of obstruction, citing specific dates, incidents, and impacts. Maya's logbook of events became a legal record. The photos, timestamps, and voice messages, once a grim archive of hostility, were now weapons in their own right. The filing itself didn't demand money. It asked for something more potent: accountability and cease of interference, enforced by the court. It was around this time that the cracks in the Glen Ridge operation began to show. A member of the council, a man Maya had only met once in passing, who managed landscaping contracts for the HOA, quietly reached out through a mutual acquaintance. His message was brief but unmistakable. "I hope you keep pushing. Some of us didn't sign up for this." That was the first confirmation Maya received that not everyone inside the structure supported what was happening. It wasn't a confession, and it didn't amount to evidence, but it was enough to confirm her instincts. This wasn't a neighborhood acting in unity. It was a campaign led by a few, facilitated by many, and resisted by almost no one until now. By the end of the month, Maya found herself pulled in opposite directions. One hand assembling legal responses, the other trying to keep her business afloat under a slow, intentional siege. The pressure wasn't explosive, it was granular, designed to drain her without ever delivering a knockout punch. But Maya, who had spent years working in quiet, meticulous roles where success depended not on speed, but on endurance, was made for this. She didn't retaliate with noise or spectacle. She leaned into systems, into protocol, into the very structures that her opponents hoped she wouldn't bother to engage. Every time they escalated, she answered with something measurable, something documented, something that the law could hold. She also didn't isolate. She shared everything, not in a public campaign, but in precise, targeted communications with legal channels, county offices, compliance officers, and property rights specialists. She consulted a private land use expert, whose findings would later prove instrumental. Her strength wasn't in counterattack. It was in resilience. And in that resilience, something began to shift. Karen Grimes, once the invisible hand behind the curtain, now found herself dragged slowly but surely into visibility. Not because Maya called her out, but because the paper trail did. In this war of attrition, Karen had made one fatal mistake. She underestimated a woman who knew how to use the system without ever breaking it. Maya wasn't just standing her ground anymore. She was preparing to take theirs. The silence after filing the injunction was louder than Maya expected. There were no immediate responses, no retaliatory letters, no new signs or threats left on her property. Instead, there was a lull, a deliberate pause that felt more like calculation than surrender. It was the kind of quiet that made you second-guess whether a storm had passed or was simply circling back around, waiting for the perfect opening to strike again. Maya didn't relax. She maintained her schedule, kept logging everything, and pushed forward with what business she could still manage. But behind that calm surface was the kind of internal bracing that only comes from experience with slow-burning conflict. Not fights that explode and end, but ones that simmer beneath the surface, quietly infecting everything they touch. 3 weeks after the legal notice had been sent, the first new action arrived not as a letter, but as an absence. Her municipal permit renewal, which she had submitted a month prior for electrical expansion on the property, was returned with no explanation. The envelope came unsealed, the form inside stamped with a vague rejection. Insufficient justification for infrastructure demand in non-integrated zone. Maya read the words twice before calling the permitting office directly. She was told that a zoning board review had recently updated community interface thresholds in areas surrounding Glenridge. Her parcel, they said, fell within a new assessment zone. It didn't matter that her use hadn't changed or that her designation hadn't been updated. The thresholds had. And that meant, for now, the upgrade was blocked. Maya asked for documentation. She was told it would be mailed. It wasn't. The next disruption came less subtly. One morning, she arrived to find her gravel access road partially blocked by a dumpster. Not one she had ordered, and not one placed there by mistake. It sat at an angle across her gate as if dropped hastily by someone who didn't intend to explain. The side of it bore the logo of a regional waste management company that Maya hadn't used. When she called the dispatcher, they told her the rental had been placed on behalf of Glenridge Community Grounds as part of shared debris collection efforts. Maya's property, they said, was listed on the work order as a temporary staging point. She asked for a copy. They refused, citing client privacy. It took Dorian's intervention, including a formal cease and desist and a direct threat of litigation, to have the dumpster removed, and even then it sat there for another 6 days before a truck finally came to retrieve it. No one apologized. Shortly after that, she received notice from her commercial liability insurer. Her premiums had been increased due to a flagged report in the system describing her site as contested and under regulatory review. Maya's agent was apologetic but clear. Someone had submitted a third-party risk report which triggered an automatic reassessment. Maya requested a copy of the report and was denied access, told it had been anonymously filed through a government-adjacent portal. She wasn't even allowed to see what exactly it said. What she did receive, however, was a copy of her newly adjusted premium, nearly double what she had been paying before. The pressure campaign was back in full swing, but now it was smarter, more methodical, less theatrical. The goal wasn't to scare her off. It was to choke her operation slowly, economically, procedurally. Maya knew the strategy. You don't break someone by attacking them outright. You break them by layering disruption upon disruption until exhaustion does the rest. But Maya had grown up around people who didn't panic when things got hard. Her mother had once worked 3 jobs while going through chemotherapy. Her grandfather had run a garage for 30 years while battling an unfair tax lien. They didn't collapse when systems pushed back. They documented, they appealed, they fought on paper as hard as others fought with fists. Maya was no different. She didn't let emotion drive her response. She let the facts speak for her. She expanded her documentation. Every email, every returned permit, every policy update, every suspicious vehicle idling across the road, all of it went into the growing file that Dorian now jokingly referred to as the Bible. She reached out to a second land use consultant, not to replace the first, but to layer their assessments for redundancy. She filed public records requests. She requested copies of all planning meetings held by the Glenridge Council for the last 12 months. She began assembling a timeline, not just of what had happened to her, but what had happened to others around the perimeter of the neighborhood. And that was when the scope began to reveal itself. 2 other property owners, neither of whom she had known prior, had been contacted by a community liaison committee and asked if they would consider selling parcels to the council for shared neighborhood benefit. One declined and later reported finding damage to their water pump. The other, after weeks of unreturned calls to utility services, agreed to sell at a discount just to be done with the hassle. Neither had known who Karen Grimes was. Neither had considered a connection. But when Maya asked if they had ever received formal letters, the kind she'd gotten, They both said no. Their pressure had been informal, quiet, a series of unexplained roadblocks. Maya brought this to Dorian. His analysis was sobering. "This looks like a pattern," he said. "It's not official policy, and that's exactly the point. It's a culture of push-out. They get what they want by making it untenable for anyone not already part of the club." He paused. This isn't just about your parcel anymore. This is a test case. If they can do it to you, they can do it to anyone. And you've already survived longer than they expected." For the first time, Maya understood that her case had crossed a line. It was no longer about her sign, or her business, or her electrical upgrade. It was about whether someone could buy a piece of land, follow every rule, and still be driven out by a coalition of unaccountable individuals acting through veiled tactics. It was about whether private property meant anything if your neighbors didn't like how you used it. It was about the ability of a small group of self-elected community figures to disrupt a life without ever appearing in court or writing their names on anything traceable. So she changed tactics. Quietly, without making a show of it, she scheduled a formal land use inspection with a representative from the county's External Zoning Compliance Office, a neutral third party with no ties to Glenridge or any of its extensions. The inspector arrived unannounced by Maya's request and spent 2 hours on site reviewing her storage units, her fencing, her signage, her drainage systems. At the end of the visit, he nodded and said, "Everything here's by the book. I've seen this before. Someone trying to out-administer you off your own land." His report would become part of the formal record, and though it wouldn't stop what was coming next, it would form another pillar in the growing wall of evidence. Because what came next was not another notice or shutdown or threat. It was a vote, a quietly added agenda item in the Glenridge Planning Meeting minutes authorizing the exploration of perimeter beautification through adjacent lot integration. Maya's parcel, though unnamed, was the only adjacent lot in that category. They weren't hiding it anymore. They were setting the stage to push for legal acquisition. Whether through eminent domain or forced easement or negotiated surrender, they were moving. But Maya had already moved first. It was the meeting minutes that shifted everything. Not the vote itself, which had been predictable and vaguely worded enough to pass unchallenged, but the way it was recorded. The phrasing, the embedded assumptions, the casual erasure of facts that Maya knew to be documented, indisputable, and legally binding. The line that caught her attention came near the end of the summary. The Council further agrees to pursue informal discussions with non-integrated property owners regarding potential inclusion in long-term land harmonization strategy. It was an elegant way to say, "We're still coming for you, just not all at once." Maya read that sentence over and over again, each time more aware of how careful and deliberate the wording was, designed to sound innocuous to the uninformed but to deliver a clear message to its intended audience. They weren't just planning around her, they were planning over her, as if she had already conceded. She hadn't. She wouldn't. But the documents now being generated were written as if her defeat was a foregone conclusion. Maya brought the language to Dorian, who studied it in silence, his fingers tapping slowly against his desk before he spoke. "This isn't just optics anymore," he said. "They're trying to manufacture a paper trail that redefines your presence on that land. If they create enough false context, minutes, complaints, proposals, it becomes very difficult to unwind the narrative later. You stop being an owner and start being a problem in the archive." He paused, then added, "We need a witness, someone neutral, someone they didn't anticipate having access to." The next day, Maya's case file was shared with a senior auditor in the county's Municipal Compliance Review Division, a woman known for being methodical, unsentimental, and deeply uninterested in local politics. Her review would not be fast, but it would be thorough. It was a calculated step, One Maya knew would not make the opposition back off, but might make them hesitate. And even a moment of hesitation was enough to reposition the board. Meanwhile, Maya requested an independent title reassessment. Though she had no reason to doubt her deed, she understood now how critical it was to have up-to-date verification from outside the initial sale. The reassessment returned with no surprises. Full ownership, clean boundaries, unrestricted commercial use under the current classification, but it included something else, something Maya hadn't seen before. A marginal annotation noting a pending land survey inquiry filed by a third party. She followed up immediately and traced the request back to a private surveying firm based one town over. The client listed: Glenridge Community Council. The stated purpose: preliminary alignment study for coordinated land management. Maya forwarded the document to Dorian with one sentence. So now they're building maps. This was the middle of the game, not the peak of drama, but the part where all the real pieces moved quietly and without the flash of earlier confrontations. Maya felt the weight of it not in new signs or surprise visits, but in the constant recalibration of strategy, the need to stay ahead of a campaign that was no longer personal but institutional. She noticed new cars parked longer at the corners of the loop road. She noticed a subtle shift in tone when speaking to clerks in the utility office, a new layer of caution, as if they'd been warned that she might be difficult. She even caught wind of a rumor, one repeated by a vendor who quickly apologized, that she had lost her permit and was under enforcement review. The lie had already begun to metastasize, passed from neighbor to neighbor like gossip, leaving her to correct the record with people who barely knew her. It wasn't about facts anymore. It was about perception. Yet Maya refused to yield to paranoia. Instead, she doubled down on process. Every fabrication was countered with documentation. Every rumor was traced, noted, and addressed quietly through the appropriate channel. She avoided escalation, avoided spectacle, and in doing so she created a stark contrast between herself and those who moved against her. Where they operated in whispers, she responded with precision. Where they blurred lines, she drew them darker. It didn't stop them, at least not yet, but it altered the tone. The anonymous calls slowed. The sudden visits stopped, and for the first time in months, her presence on that land no longer felt embattled. It felt defended. But perhaps the most significant development came not from Maya's side at all, but from within Glenridge. A quiet leak. A package of documents mailed anonymously to Dorian's office containing internal email chains, budget outlines, and planning correspondence dating back 2 years. In those messages, Karen Grimes' name appeared repeatedly, attached to directives, funding requests, and notes discussing buffer realignment opportunities and strategic reclamation of fringe parcels. The tone of the emails was polite, but unmistakably proprietary, as if the land had always belonged to Glenridge, and owners like Maya were just temporary obstacles. Most damning was a draft proposal that listed projected revenue from new community installations pending parcel acquisition. Maya's lot was listed, coded by address with an estimated development value in the low 6 figures. The document was dated 8 months before she'd even moved a single structure onto the property. It was the moment Maya had been waiting for, the irrefutable confirmation that this wasn't about aesthetics or complaints or neighborhood unity. It was about money, about expansion, about converting independent land into shared investment by coercion, paperwork, and silence. She didn't know who had sent the leak. Maybe someone inside who'd grown tired of watching the abuse. Maybe someone afraid of being named later. It didn't matter. What mattered was that now she had more than just her story. She had theirs, in their own words. Dorian was cautious. "We don't move on this yet," he said. "We build, quietly, strategically. This isn't a silver bullet, but it's leverage. And if they realize you have it too soon, they'll pivot. Maya understood. This was no longer just a matter of defense. It was the beginning of something more. A shift from holding ground to preparing a strike, not out of vengeance but out of necessity. Because the longer she remained silent, the more emboldened they became. And Maya Coleman had never been one to let someone else write the final version of her story. The silence that followed the internal document leak did not last. In fact, it was shorter than Maya had anticipated, and far more calculated than she had prepared for. By the time Dorian had vetted the documents, confirmed their authenticity through metadata and matching internal contact formats, and stored them securely in his encrypted case system, Glenridge had already adjusted its approach. They didn't deny the content. They didn't retaliate directly. Instead, they moved their pressure campaign into a new arena, the financial. It began with an innocuous email from a payment processing vendor that Maya used for a portion of her storage rental system. The message, friendly and templated, stated that her account had been flagged for review due to inconsistencies in zoning status related to one or more listed service addresses. Maya immediately recognized the coded language. Someone had submitted a challenge to her usage terms, likely anonymously, likely citing one of the fabricated zoning status changes. The vendor wasn't blaming her. They were simply pausing services pending clarification. An administrative shutdown with no formal accusation, no opportunity to appeal, just a frozen pipe that cut into her monthly revenue stream. She contacted support, submitted documents proving her permits, her zoning designation, her legal usage rights, all of it clean, accurate, recent. The company thanked her for the information and told her it would be reviewed by their internal legal team. That was the last she heard from them for 2 weeks. During that time, 2 additional service providers, a software subscription and a courier logistics firm, issued their own proactive compliance suspensions, citing undefined community regulation disputes as reason to temporarily close her account, pending internal audit. In practical terms, Maya had been quietly removed from a digital layer of operation. Not because she broke any rules, but because the systems she used were more afraid of being sued by a collective body than of disrupting one individual's lawful work. This wasn't oversight. It was coordinated attrition. Quiet, clean, effective. What made it worse was the pace. These weren't scattershot attacks anymore. They were waves. Every few days a new disruption, each of them plausible in isolation, but devastating in sequence. Her insurance provider sent a non-renewal notice for her umbrella policy due to ongoing dispute-related risk indicators, again based on reports filed through third-party review channels. Her backup power contractor delayed installation pending neighborhood approval, which they had never previously required. And when she tried to register for an upcoming agricultural compliance seminar, the kind that would have offered valuable access to state-level land use experts, her application was returned with a form note. Currently under locality review due to pending community compatibility issue. That last phrase stopped her. Community compatibility issue. It was the language of denial without confrontation. Bureaucracy designed to remove someone without the burden of saying why. Maya knew she was nearing the limits of procedural endurance. The architecture of harassment was no longer just made of paper notices or whispered rumors. It had become infrastructural, embedded in systems that now moved independently of the people who started the fire. That was always the danger of institutional sabotage. Once the lie had enough weight behind it, it began to sustain itself. She brought all of it to Dorian, who listened carefully, said nothing for several minutes, and then finally leaned back in his chair and muttered, "They're betting you'll run out of money before we run out of legal remedies." And he was right. Not because she was financially unstable, but because the cost of constantly restoring what had been wrongly taken from her was mounting. And behind every effort to recover stood another form, another policy, Another blank-faced support agent who understood your frustration but could do nothing until internal compliance teams reviewed the status. No one admitted fault. No one apologized. The system wasn't broken. It was just never meant to protect someone like her. That's when Maya made a decision that would change the tempo of the fight. She returned not to the law, but to the ledger. She went through every invoice, every fee, every blocked order and delayed payment. She compiled a master record of loss, not for court, not for insurance, but for herself. And once it was done, she stared at the columns until she noticed something she hadn't seen before. The dates didn't align randomly. Each escalation, each new disruption, occurred within 72 hours of Glenridge council meetings or planning sessions. Even when the meetings didn't mention her directly, the timing matched too closely to ignore. She brought this to Dorian, who immediately looped in a forensic analyst who specialized in mapping administrative behavior across legal timelines. Within days, they had a report showing pattern convergence between Glenridge meeting activity and third-party disruptions to Maya's business. It wasn't proof in the criminal sense, but it was circumstantial alignment at a level no attorney could pretend was coincidence. With this data in hand, Maya and Dorian filed a formal complaint not with the local zoning board, which had already shown signs of being compromised, but with the state-level Small Business Administration Oversight Division. The complaint named Glenridge Community Council as a source of coordinated administrative interference, outlined the damages incurred, listed 37 distinct events over a period of 4 months, and submitted the forensic timeline as an appendix. The filing was careful not to accuse individuals, not yet, but it opened the door for the state to initiate its own inquiry. And once that inquiry began, every internal document at Glenridge became a matter of public record. Maya expected retaliation, but instead, something stranger happened. Karen Grimes vanished. Not literally. She still attended council meetings, still appeared at events, but her name stopped showing up on documents. Her emails, once prolific and attached to every policy revision and complaint form, were suddenly absent. Instead, actions were submitted by committee, on behalf of the council, or through subcommittee liaison channels. It was a legal shell game, designed to dilute accountability, and for a while it worked. But it also revealed something Maya had suspected from the start. Karen wasn't working alone, and she had never been just a nosy neighbor with too much time on her hands. She was part of a structure, one that had financial incentives, political ambitions, and long-term development plans. The leaked documents had hinted at it, but now the behavior confirmed it. Glenridge wasn't trying to punish Maya for being out of step. They were trying to normalize the idea that what she owned was already theirs in theory. She just hadn't accepted it yet. The final blow in the second escalation didn't come in the form of a court notice or anonymous tip. It came from a man in a beige suit who arrived unannounced at Maya's gate in a marked vehicle with no name on the side, just a number and a county seal. He introduced himself as a district consultant for cooperative planning engagement, handed Maya a folder, and told her he was following up on community unification opportunities. Inside the folder was a proposal, dry, overly formatted, and riddled with legalese, that essentially offered to buy Maya's land at 70% of its current appraised value in the interest of community cohesion and long-term shared benefit. No threats, no accusations, just an offer, written in the voice of inevitability. The consultant smiled the entire time, as if it was obvious what the right choice was. Maya didn't shout. She didn't argue. She closed the folder, thanked him for the materials, and told him she'd review it with her attorney. He nodded politely, returned to his vehicle, and drove away. When Dorian read the document, he didn't speak for almost 5 minutes. Then he said, "This is extortion written like opportunity. They're trying to settle quietly before the state steps in." He closed the folder and looked at Maya with a mix of admiration and concern. "Oh, you've held longer than anyone expected. Now they're trying to buy silence before exposure costs them more than your land is worth." But Maya Coleman hadn't come this far to sell. Not her land, and not her voice. The hearing was never supposed to be public. It was scheduled as a closed administrative review between Maya's legal team, representatives from the Glenridge Council, and a 3-member oversight panel from the State Property Compliance Board. But the moment the state accepted jurisdiction over the case, everything changed. Documents that had been sealed under local privilege became accessible under public records law. Transcripts were logged. Procedural history became case history. And somewhere along the way, someone, maybe a clerk, maybe a whistleblower, flagged the file to the regional press bulletin. It didn't result in a media frenzy, but it drew attention. Enough that when the hearing convened, there were people Maya didn't recognize sitting in the back of the room, listening closely, taking notes, not journalists with cameras, but policy analysts, land rights researchers, and a quiet observer from a neighboring district's legal affairs office. Karen Grimes walked into the hearing wearing a tailored suit and a fixed expression, flanked by 2 advisors and a community development consultant who introduced himself without offering a business card. She didn't look at Maya. She didn't have to. For her, this was still a formality, one she expected to manipulate, delay, or dismiss with the same quiet arrogance that had worked so many times before. But Maya knew something had shifted. This was no longer Glenridge's court. It was now governed by state-level procedure, bound by evidence, and guided by officials who had no personal stake in neighborhood gossip or informal alliances. The proceedings began with procedural clarifications, then transitioned into presentation of the facts, a process Maya had grown intimately familiar with over the past several months. Dorian delivered the timeline like a surgeon performing a practiced incision. He began with the initial interference, the painted-over sign, then moved methodically through each escalation. The fake notices, the altered documents, the permit delays, the insurance sabotage, the financial disruptions, and, finally, the offer to purchase her property under thinly veiled coercion. Each point was supported by documents, images, email metadata, and sworn declarations. When it came time to introduce the leaked Glenridge documents, the internal budget outlines, the pre-planned development schedules listing her property as a pending acquisition, the room shifted. Not with noise, but with the kind of alert stillness that comes when the atmosphere thickens with consequence. Karen's attorney objected to the inclusion of the leaked files, claiming lack of provenance, but the panel chair overruled, noting that authenticity had been verified through multiple independent data points, and that the documents had not been contested for factual accuracy since their disclosure. That silence, more than anything, spoke volumes. Karen finally spoke during the panel's direct questioning. Her tone was calm, deliberate, almost maternal. She expressed regret that the situation had become adversarial and suggested that perhaps the issue stemmed from a mutual misunderstanding of community integration goals. She claimed Glenridge had acted only in the interest of safety, order, and unified development, and emphasized that no individual within the council had ever acted maliciously. It was a performance, polished, rehearsed, legally engineered to create doubt without taking responsibility. But she made a mistake. When asked specifically why Glenridge submitted a request to survey Maya's land months before any dispute had arisen, she answered too quickly, saying, "It's standard procedure when anticipating realignment proposals." That statement, innocuous to most ears, contradicted every claim she'd made about the conflict being reactive. Dorian seized on it. He motioned for the document showing her name on the requisition form, dated 8 months before Maya had installed her first unit. The panel noted the discrepancy. Karen didn't speak again. The hearing lasted 4 hours. When it ended, the room cleared slowly, people speaking in low voices, scribbling notes. Karen left first, her posture still straight, but her expression less fixed. Dorian didn't smile. He never did in rooms like that. He only packed his binder, nodded once to Maya, and said, "Now we wait." The ruling came 2 weeks later. In a unanimous decision, the panel found that the Glenridge Council, under the leadership of Karen Grimes, had knowingly and repeatedly engaged in unauthorized, extrajudicial interference with a legally compliant property owner, resulting in material harm to operations, reputational injury, and unlawful coercive behavior under the guise of community authority. The ruling included a mandate for Glenridge to cease all administrative actions concerning Maya's property, submit to a 6-month audit of their decision-making processes, and publicly retract their development plans involving adjacent private lots. But it didn't stop there. The state referred the case to the Attorney General's office for further review under statutes governing abuse of administrative authority and possible civil conspiracy to deprive property rights under color of law. That same week, Maya received confirmation from the municipal office that her permits had been reinstated in full, her zoning designation affirmed without dispute, and all previously flagged issues expunged from her record. Vendors resumed service. Her insurance premiums returned to prior levels. Her delivery accounts were restored. And yet, none of that brought her satisfaction. Not because it didn't matter, it did, but because she understood how close she had come to being erased not by force, but by a system designed to dismantle people like her quietly, through forms, meetings, and loopholes. She thought about the other names on those internal Glenridge documents. Other parcels, other people who hadn't fought back, or hadn't had the resources to do so. She knew what would have happened to her if she hadn't documented everything, hired a competent attorney, and refused to take the bait of emotional retaliation. She would have been a footnote, a compliance issue resolved by removal. And no one would have ever known the truth, but now they would. And Karen Grimes? Within days of the ruling, a new listing appeared on the county auction docket. A residential property, once the pride of Glenridge, placed into accelerated pre-foreclosure proceedings due to non-compliance with audit enforcement terms. The address was hers. The auction notice went live without fanfare, tucked between dozens of listings on the county website, formatted in plain text with parcel numbers, addresses, and starting bids. But for those who knew where to look, and more importantly, for those who knew what it meant, it was a reckoning written in numbers. Karen Grimes's house, the 2-story colonial at the corner of Glenridge's eastern loop, was listed for sale under Special Enforcement Compliance Lien, with a notation that the property had failed to meet conditions of state-ordered administrative restitution. The news didn't break through in headlines or community bulletins. Glenridge was too insular for public embarrassment to be openly acknowledged. But the silence was different now. Thicker, heavier, the kind of silence that follows collapse, when people look at a situation and realize the structure they relied on had been built on something weaker than they imagined. Karen had not been removed forcibly, not in the way she had tried to remove Maya, through implication and erosion. No, her removal was procedural, precise, a direct consequence of the very system she once believed she could control without oversight. And now, the home she once hosted planning meetings in, the property that anchored her presence in Glenridge, was no longer hers. It was a line item in a sale she could not prevent. Maya didn't celebrate. She didn't attend the auction, didn't watch the bids climb or try to meet the buyer. That wasn't the point. Her focus had already shifted back to what she had fought to protect. The land, the business, the life she had been building before the campaign against her began. The storage units were full again. The suppliers had returned. The cold chain system she'd constructed in partnership with regional growers was not only functional, but expanding, with new contracts in neighboring counties. There were still remnants of the battle, legal paperwork, records, a lingering wariness when opening certain emails, but the day-to-day rhythm of her work had resumed. Oh, and it felt, for the first time in months, like progress was no longer conditional. She had her space, not just physically but politically, legally, psychologically. It was hers again. What lingered, more than anything, was awareness. Maya walked her property differently now. Not with fear or defensiveness, but with alertness. The understanding that ownership in theory means very little without the ability to defend it in practice. She had learned, intimately, how systems designed to protect property could be hijacked by those who understood their weaknesses. She had seen how false legitimacy could be cloaked in committee titles, how silence could become complicity, how the language of community could be wielded like a weapon against those who didn't conform to a narrow definition of belonging. And she had refused to let it define her. That refusal, more than any single legal victory, was what endured. She hadn't set out to change Glenridge, and she hadn't. The people there would go on, likely with new leadership, likely with a quieter posture for a while. But something had shifted permanently, not just in policy, but in perception. Other property owners had begun asking questions. Some were requesting audits of their own. One small landowner retracted an application to sell, citing a renewed sense of stability. Maya hadn't inspired a revolution, but she had broken the illusion of inevitability. And in places like Glenridge, that was enough to redraw the lines. On a warm evening, 2 weeks after the auction, Maya installed a new sign at the edge of her property, not because she needed to. By now, everyone knew whose land it was, but because she wanted to mark the return, not just of territory, but of truth. The sign wasn't bold or aggressive. It was simple, clean, cast in brushed steel, anchored in reinforced concrete. It read, "Private property. Legally established. Rights enforced." Below that, in smaller type, another line. "This land is not borrowed. It is owned." She didn't expect anyone to challenge it again, but if they did, she was ready. And as the sun dipped low behind the tree line, casting long shadows over the boundary she had once been told she didn't belong behind, Maya stood quietly and let herself breathe. Not relief, not pride, but clarity. This wasn't a story of revenge. It wasn't even a story of justice in the traditional sense. It was a story of survival through discipline, resistance through systems, and victory not through escalation, but through refusal to be erased. Karen Grimes would disappear from the records in time, absorbed into some other district, her name replaced in the future minutes by someone newer, someone smoother. But for those who watched what had unfolded, for those who knew the contours of what had been attempted and failed, her name would always mean something else. And Maya Coleman? She remained. Not as a footnote, but as the one who had stayed when staying meant the most.